Welcome to Hope is Here. My name is Greg Horn, and really excited about our guest today. It's a friend of mine that I met when I first came back to Lexington, and we got reconnected of a book that he wrote recently. And Robert Hall was kind enough to send me a copy of his book called Fifth and Hope. And obviously our show is called Hope is Here, and he saw on Facebook that I had started this program and said, hey, I thought you might like this. And then when I got it, I found out that it was a fiction book, and a real transparent guy, as those of you who've been listening the last 3 months know, and I was like, oh, super. But as I started reading this book, I couldn't put it down. And then 3 days later, I had all 200-plus pages read, and just really was touched by the book. It was very interesting. There was history in it. There was humor. There was faith, real-life situations, and just a phenomenal book. So I wanted to have my friend Robert Hall on today talking about his book called Fifth and Hope. So, Robert, you're not living in Kentucky any longer, so welcome to Hope is Here. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. I really appreciate you having me on. I live most of my life now down here in the subtropics in St. Pete, Florida, and haven't got back home because Kentucky still is home, but I certainly look forward to coming back there sometime soon and like we said, share a moment of coffee and that sort of thing. But I really appreciate you having me on today.
All right. Well, Robert, you wrote this book, Fifth and Hope. It's a novel, and you wrote it under the pen name of Nathaniel Sewell. Share a little bit about how that came about.
Well, it's a really great question from the standpoint of this is actually my third novel. My first novel was a novel named Bobby's Socks, and it was a tough story. It was about child abuse and the epigenetic link to suicide. And when I wrote it, my wife at the time, we just kind of went, I don't want to write it. It's not really a biography, but it has part of my life in it, like all of my books do. And so we decided over a decade ago that I would use a pen name for it. And we never had kids, but if we'd had a boy, we would have named him Nathaniel, because we just liked the name. And then my grandfather, he was a preacher. His name was Sewell. And so I took my grandfather's first name as my last name and my pen name. So I write under a pen name. It's my brand. It stays separate from my other career, and it's sort of my outlet, my artistic outlet. But I take it very seriously. And so, in a way, the name is a moniker for the type of books I write, and it's sort of my little brand now. And so I enjoy it; it's fun, but I don't hide the fact that I have a pen name. I'm certainly not anywhere near Mark Twain or anything like that. But it certainly, I think, turned out pretty well. I think most people kind of like the name. It's kind of different and kind of has a nice ring to it.
Well, it really does. I like the name, and I love the title of the book, Fifth and Hope, obviously, with my program being called Hope is Here. How did you come about the title for the book?
That's a really good question. Years ago, I happened to tell a friend of mine that my grandparents actually met at the corner of 5th and Hope Streets in downtown Los Angeles in 1926. My grandparents were students at Biola, Bible Institute of Los Angeles. And I remember she said, that would make a great novel title, Robert. You ought to do that. And I went, that's great, but, I really kind of have to have a story to go with the title. So I really didn't have a story at the time. But from the name over the years, I just sort of rolled in my head, and then that's how I came up with the story that I entitled Fifth and Hope.
Well, so I'm assuming since the title came and this is in the book, so this is based off some of this book's definitely based off true information then.
It is, and in truth, it's a fictional novel, but that's redundant, it's fiction, but I took the name and then kind of backed into the story. My grandparents actually left Los Angeles in 1930 and drove back across the country along the original Route 66 in a Model A Ford. And I thought, I had an idea in my head about a character and what would drive a character, and then I went, oh, I got it. And so the story sort of popped in my head one time, and I just sort of started playing with it. And like a lot of folks who write novels, I came up with the ending first. And once I had an ending, and then I had a beginning, that's when I began to write the story. And it is based on like my grandparents' history. They were Brethren missionary ministers in eastern Kentucky for 42 years. And so, they were great, wonderful human beings that I, to this day, I miss. If that tells you anything, I mean, it's kind of interesting. We happen to be talking about the very day that Reverend Graham passed, and in a way, I remember every day my grandfather being a minister and being that kind of person. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition in terms of appreciating those human beings and what they were all about. I mean, they were all in with both feet. They weren't in there to make money. They were in there about sharing their message, and they did a great job. So in a way, I hope the book honors them. That it might be a tip-off. I don't think it gives away the story, but if you look at the book cover, there is a chapel there, and that chapel comes from my grandparents' chapel in eastern Kentucky. In specific, it was in Clayhole, Kentucky, which is way out there. So it's a special place for me.
Well, that's why I think our listening audience, we reach 13 different counties here in central Kentucky live on the radio, 12:45 to 1 p.m. That we've got podcasts. Last time I checked, last week, 12 different states that listen to that. But so much of it, people relate to Kentucky's things that you place in there. And you talk about Keeneland a little bit, Kentucky Wildcat basketball.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think there's a lot of things of local interest, yet it starts in California, like you talked about, where your grandparents met. And I was not familiar with Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, but just thought you did such a great job with tying things together. And like I said, I couldn't hardly put the book down, so I think people would really, really enjoy it. And like I said, I'm embarrassed to say it, I'm not a fiction reader, but as you're sitting here sharing with us, a lot of it's not actually fiction, but you did such a great job tying everything together. I wanted to share a few things out of the book and just get some feedback from you, because I just thought maybe is this stuff you learned from your grandparents, or just how did you come about it? I loved on page 23 in the book, you said, my grandfather, the main character in the book says, the grandfather always taught me to be kind, but he also taught me how to deal with strangers. It was easy for him. He was a preacher, a man of God, so he was expected to care about all of God's children and listen to them, complain about how unfair life had been to them, or how wonderful their life was and how important they were. Yet he treated them all the same. And being a former pastor full-time for about 12 years, I could so relate to what he said there. But then I liked in the next sentence you wrote, as I paced around the garage, I remembered a comment he had made to me. Bobby, let people talk. It makes them feel better. And, Robert, I just find that as we get older, we're close to the same age. I think I'm a year or two older. But, man, we all want to be heard, don't we?
We do, and I think that's part of what I learned from my grandfather, and what I try to pass along in the story in Fifth and Hope is the character Bobby is not a likable character. I'll just tell people that up front. He's tough. He's done very well for himself, but he's also kind of isolated himself. And when you go through that kind of a process and you have those sort of characters, and I can somewhat, to a certain extent, identify with the character, and then he starts to reflect on his grandfather in terms of how he treated people. And to a great extent, I've been successful in my own business career because I learned many, many years ago a couple things, one of which comes directly from my grandfather, which those quotes you picked up, Greg, are very prescient, because that's exactly how I tried to learn to treat people. I try to treat them where I just sat and listened to them very intently, what they were saying to me. And in terms of trying not to think about what I wanted to respond to, but listen to them and empower them to really feel like we're having a conversation that I fully am engaged with. I think that's extremely important. Probably more so in the ministry than it is obviously in a business career, but I have a lot of clients over the years that would call and talk to me for literally an hour, and they'd get off the phone with me and go, "Thank you, Robert, for just talking to me." And I'm like, "You got it. That's fine." And I think that comes from my grandfather and my grandparents in terms of how humble they were. And I think that's extremely important. There are other things that I learned that kind of come from that are some of my business mentors always told me, said, "Robert, never pick on anybody that can't defend themselves. It's not fair." And I always remembered those things. I mean, one of my business mentors was a gentleman there in Lexington named Doug Gibson. He and Billy Smith, I used to work with them. They are the proprietors of the Gibson Company. It's a real estate company. And I always remember how they treated people. They're always very, very good at very distinctly listening to what they had to say. And so part of that comes from my grandfather, obviously, and the other part obviously comes from some of my business mentors who really sat me down and taught me how to talk to people. So I appreciate you picking up on that, because I was pretty proud of that part of the section of the book, because I really thought that really kind of shined light on the kind of character my grandfather was.
Well, it really did speak to me. I highlighted, put stars by it. Just kind of something I do. And like I said, I normally read nonfiction, but you've got so many really good takeaways in this book that I really want to encourage and challenge people to, if you're not a fiction reader, to step out and get out of the boat, as the old saying goes. If you want to walk on the water, do this, because I was really stretched and grew from reading it, even though with it being fiction. Just some really good takeaways. Another thing that you talked about, Robert, on page 28 in the book, it says by most the main character is kind of talking here. He says, by most measures, even my own expectations, I had succeeded, but in truth, I didn't feel any different. It was like having a hidden tick suck your life away. And, me having spent time full ministry, now doing this program just to encourage people and give people hope, I find so many people that have just, driven themselves, and then they get to our age, late 40s, early 50s, and yet they still feel empty. And so I just thought that was such a great quote, because sometimes even though you may have the nice car, the nice house, and, the picture-perfect family stuff, yet there's still not peace and all the nice material things that there's nothing wrong with. God loves to bless his kids. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But sometimes these successful measures, they actually suck the life away from us, just like you said in your book.
Yeah, that really was important in terms of setting the tone of the kind of character. The basic predicate behind that, Greg, is ultimately what would drive someone like this, who lives in Northern California at Carmel by the Sea. He's done extraordinarily well into multi-billionaire hedge fund guy, which a lot of those guys are, you wouldn't even know them if they walk right by you. But what would drive a person like that after the death of his mother to then drive along the original Route 66, following the characters, the diaries that he finds of his grandfather? What would drive him to do that? He doesn't need to do that. He can hop in a plane, go anywhere he wants. Why does he want to do that? That's what drives the book. What is driving Bobby almost to the point where he just has no peace? He's quite depressed and sad, really, when you think about it. He's distant from his wife, and yet he's got, on the surface, as you well point out, Greg, he's got everything you wanted. He's got money, prestige, power, and yet something's not there. And that's what I tried to unfold the character with respect to, over time, watching him change, how he treats the Amy character, who is, by any measure, kind of a wild and crazy sort of free, millennial-type person that might be a little off-putting to some people, but he's trying to grapple with this generation. He's trying to grapple with what, in many respects, he never got. And that's what really hits the story. And I don't want to kind of give it away, but that's what drives the character. And that's why he drives all the way back from California, right back into Lexington, as you kind of mentioned. I thought those were some good areas to kind of give the character Bobby an opportunity to kind of shine a light on where he grew up, where he's from. And he's really trying to shine that light for Amy. He's trying to show her something. And the question becomes why. I'm not going to answer that. That's where the book goes. But
right.
That's kind of what drives people. They're not happy. I don't care how successful you are. I've been extraordinarily successful in some ways, other ways not. And I know what it feels like to be empty. I know what it feels like to feel loneliness. I get that, but I've learned over time not to walk away from those feelings, but to face them. And when you face them and you feel them, then when you're happy and when things are going great, you feel that too. But it can be a scary moment. I think a lot of folks in life don't allow themselves to feel, to get into those positions, regardless of what has happened to them.